Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, July 11th, 2022, and today we are going to be talking about President Joe Biden and a new poll from the New York Times and Siena College that shows some very fascinating results for the President of the United States. Now, President Biden has made it clear that he intends to run for re-election in 2024. However, the majority of Democrats and the nation does not want him to do so. But despite an overwhelming disapproval of his job performance and inability to coalesce behind him for 2024, you find that voters here still prefer Joe Biden over President Donald Trump, which shows that there is some type of disconnect between the approval rating polls, the primary polls, and the general election polls. Now, I don't doubt some of the numbers that have been released by the New York Times. In fact, I don't think this poll is as skewed as maybe it could have been 4 years ago under the Trump presidency. What we have found from the New York Times Siena College is that even in 2016, they got the popular vote pretty correct. Now, I get it. This is not the 2016 presidential election, nor is it the 2024 presidential election yet. But focusing on it is super important because we don't know what's going to happen amongst Democrats, amongst Republicans. Right now, we're treating it like an open race, despite having an incumbent president who can run for re-election. So let's talk about some of the numbers that have been released and why this poll is showing some very interesting results. So to begin, the main headline here is that Joe Biden's approval rating hits a very new low, a very significant low at that, with 33% of Americans saying that they do not approve, 33% of Americans say they approve of Joe Biden's job performance. That is just 1 in 3 Americans. That is getting to the level of George W. Bush during some of his lowest points in his entire presidency. Donald Trump never hit an average of 33%. And to be fair, Joe Biden did not either. When you take a look at the Real Clear Politics average, Joe Biden is hovering around 38%. So this new New York Times Siena College poll isn't exactly the average or the one that matches a lot of the other data that we have seen, but it is still super significant. And looking at this 33% approval rating, it is accompanied by the fact that 64% of Democratic voters say they would prefer a standard bearer in the 2024 presidential election, a new one at that, someone who could be a new, revitalized voice for the Democratic Party rather than President Biden. And that seems to be something that had been pretty well established by Democratic voters following the 2020 election. When Joe Biden was elected as the oldest president in United States history, immediately discussions came around about replacing him for the 2024 election. But we don't know exactly who would, and the Biden White House has made it very clear that he absolutely intends to run for president again. But the numbers just simply don't look too favorable until you take a look at the general election data, which we will get to in just a moment. So, remind yourself, 33% of voters approve of the job that Joe Biden is doing, meaning that the majority, and sometimes overwhelming majority at that, disapprove of the job that he is doing thus far. Only 13% of the nation says that we are on the right track, the lowest point in New York Times polling since the recession in the late 2000s. You are talking about a decade between the time at which we were saying the nation was at this lowest point and going in the wrong direction versus now. It's worse than when the coronavirus hit. It's worse than some points leading into the recession. Obviously not as bad as it was then, but it actually could get worse at this point. But 13% is definitely not a good look for President Biden. Because if just 1 in 10 Americans are saying we are on the right track and nearly 8 in 10 are saying we are on the wrong track, that means he is absolutely vulnerable and the underdog for the 2024 presidential election, while simultaneously, as we will see later down this poll, one of the Democratic Party's best chances at winning at 2024. Just food for thought at that point. Looking at the approval rating broken down amongst Republicans, Democrats, and independents, Republicans and Democrats are predictable. The Republicans never liked President Biden, they were never with him, and they never saw him in a positive demeanor. The Democrats, on the other hand, always started out as positive, but you are starting to see that crack down to around 70% amongst Democrats. To remind you of where President Trump was amongst Republicans throughout the entirety of his term, no lower than 85% in terms of approval amongst the GOP, meaning that there are Democrats turning on President Biden. But again, back to that general election data, that doesn't necessarily mean they are open to voting for Donald Trump or any other Republican. But it's independent voters that Democrats should be more worried about. They don't really need to worry about their own Democratic supporters, mainly because Democratic voters are going to vote for the Democrat regardless of who they approve or disapprove of, which is likely what is elevating the Democratic Party in some of these polls that we have seen thus far. But independent voters are definitely a tricky subject, because 2/3 of independents now disapprove of the job that Joe Biden is doing, and nearly half disapprove strongly, meaning that they have a strong opinion against the president And these are independent voters that the Democratic Party needs to win by a majority in order to win re-election in 2024. The fact that Joe Biden is at 70% amongst Democrats isn't good, but I can't say I would expect any of these 30% of Democrats to vote for the GOP. Or at least there's always going to be about 8 to 10% that are identified Democrats that were already voting for the GOP. So I can't imagine that the overwhelming majority of this remaining 70%, remaining 30% out of the 100% will vote for the GOP. I still think that if Democrats disapprove of Biden, they will vote for Biden if he is the Democratic nominee, but he definitely isn't their first choice. And they actually have an account from someone who has a very similar set of feelings as what I just described. So amongst Democrats, though, 26% of them want Joe Biden to return. Now, he's the incumbent. If 26% was the number for Barack Obama in 2012, he could have been primaried, and potentially even by Hillary Clinton. And I say that as speculation. I don't say that with any true, reason to believe that. Just more so the fact that it is within the realm of possibility and was within the realm of possibility in this circumstance. But obviously, Obama was not at 26% in terms of return support for the 2012 election. Barack Obama was a very good president for the Democratic Party. I mean, his approval rating amongst them was very high during the entirety of his term. And by the time he left office, left with a plus 17 approval nationwide. So by the end of it, Obama was generally approved of by the American public. Joe Biden probably won't be in that position by the end of his first or potentially second term. And that's if he makes it through a 2024 primary. Now, I don't think many people would be willing to take on an incumbent president because if they lose, it could potentially mean political suicide, where you would find yourself in a position where you challenged an incumbent president, were beaten by an incumbent president, and potentially if that incumbent president goes on to lose, you will be blamed for their loss. Think about all the discussion that goes around Bernie Sanders running in 2016. Think about the narrative that has been pushed there by centrist and moderate Democrats. Whether it's true or not, the narrative exists. Why not remove yourself from that position, never have a narrative around you, and you can vie for the presidency against a non-incumbent in an open race or in some type of circumstance where you are propped up to practically winning the nomination, such as Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden. But still, this number is appealing to some. 26% of Democrats want him to be renominated, 74% do not. That is a huge amount that simply does not want Joe Biden to be the nominee again. But based off of history and based off of what we know so far, not a single president in U.S. history has ever been successfully primaried. Meaning that since that hasn't happened, there's no precedent for it, and it probably means that this whatever Democrat decides to run won't be defying nearly 3 centuries of history within the United States. Again, something to think about. As we said, Biden plans to run for re-election, but as said here, there is a silver lining for President Biden. That in a hypothetical rematch between Donald Trump and himself, Joe Biden still wins 44-41. Now that's good news, at least partially, because Joe Biden at a 33% approval is getting 44% of the vote amongst the same voters. So if you have 1/3 of people saying I approve of you and 2/3 saying no, that means there are voters out there, and probably Democratic voters and some independents, that don't approve of the job that you are doing, but will still never bring themselves to vote for a Republican. Right now, President Biden is down 19 points nationwide. Taking a look at the generic ballot for 2022, take a look at this. The approval rating and the generic ballot lead for the Republican Party doesn't at all correlate. Republicans lead by 3 points nationwide. Biden is down by 19. If we jump over to President Obama and then go back to the generic ballot, we can take a look at what approval ratings used to mean for the generic ballot for the Democratic Party. We go back to 2014 even. We take a look at some of these numbers. The approval rating for, or 2010 actually, is a much better example because this is what many Republicans are trying to compare their 2020 year to. Potentially they lose the Senate, but win control of the House, very similar to 2010. Around the time that the Republican Party won the 2010 midterms, Barack Obama's disapproval rating, or overall net disapproval, was 4 points higher than the approve, meaning around 1 in 2 voters disapproved of the job that President Obama was doing. 3 in 5 voters feel the same way about President Biden. But in this disapprove plus 3.7 time period for the Democratic Party, the Republicans led nationwide by 9.4%. That means that amongst the approval rating, Republicans were outperforming it by 6 points. That's fascinating, to say the least. Outperforming it by 6 points? The final result ended up being outperforming it by about 3 points, but the polls told us a different story. They told us that Obama was disapproved of, yet those who approved of Obama were still voting for the GOP. Now it's an exact opposite circumstance, and it seems to be a very similar opposite circumstance for the 2024 presidential election, because there are voters out there that simply can't bring themselves to vote for a Republican. And this poll, looking at some voters here, it actually seems to be very true. Here we have Randane Wright, a 41-year-old truck driver in Ocean Township, New Jersey, and he's one of these voters. He's angry with Biden because he thinks that Biden is not aggressive enough in getting his agenda done, saying that President Trump wasn't afraid to get his people in line. And I've seen this concern from many, many Democrats. But when you take a look at the question about a potential matchup in 2024, he says that he wouldn't consider voting for a Republican, even if faced with this rematch, even with being faced with Joe Biden as the Democratic nominee. Because some voters out there have been so pushed away from the GOP that they can disapprove of Biden even strongly and still be willing to reelect him simply because they do not want a Republican in office. This is something the Republican Party needs to have self-reflection on, because this line of messaging that President Biden utilized in the 2020 election absolutely can carry him through in 2024. Saying, don't compare me to the almighty, compare me to the alternative. And that's exactly what these voters are doing. Now, 44 to 41 means there are a lot of undecided voters, and truly speaking, they could switch up on President Biden as they did for Hillary Clinton back in 2016. But we are 2 years out, and as we know, and as Donald Trump himself can tell you, and Biden under the Obama admin can tell you, it is very possible to turn around this low approval rating into something closer. Might not necessarily be positive by election day. Obama was disapproved of when he was reelected with 332 electoral votes in 2012, but it's possible to turn it around, because the only reason why the 2020 presidential election was close was because Donald Trump was disapproved of by just 8 points. 3 years prior to the 2020 election, Donald Trump was down 17, 18 points nationwide. 2 years prior, down 11, 13 points nationwide. 1 year down, a similar amount. He rebuilt his approval rating, getting closer to the 2020 election successfully, because that's exactly what happens when you have a president. When you take a look at Obama's approval rating in 2014, for instance, what you will find is that in that time frame, Obama was down 12 points, 14 points nationwide, 10 points. But 2 years later, by the time we rolled around to the November election, on election day, in fact, Obama was approved of by 7 points. And when he left office, by 18 points. That's fascinating, but it shows you just how much can change in such a brief period of time. And that's what the Democratic Party can do, which is why this is a glimmer of good news for Joe Biden, because it means that even with a 33% approval rating, he is garnering 44% of the vote, which means should Joe Biden return it to where it was in other circumstances, meaning early 2021, later down 2021, let's say he's disapproved of by just 5 points on election day 2024, Joe Biden has a very realistic shot at victory, because that's exactly how the numbers have trended. As unfortunate as it is for the GOP, and as unfortunate as it was for the Democrats back in 2020, being down in the approval doesn't necessarily mean easy defeat or an easy victory for the opposition party. The Democrats struggled for their 2020 victory. Look at the hundreds of millions of dollars they spent in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. Biden was up in high single digits and Trump's approval rating was down. But what happened was they got closer. Trump turned it around in the final stretch of the campaign season, and it got close. Trump was down 8 points nationwide and only lost the election by 44,000 votes out of over 150 million cast. That tells you everything you need to know about how close elections can be despite approval ratings, otherwise forcing you to think about it in a different perspective. Right now, I still think President Biden would lose to President Trump in a potential rematch. And I think that's what the polls actually are slightly indicating. When you take a look at the 2016 numbers between Clinton and Trump, the New York Times actually predicted exactly what they are predicting today, that Hillary Clinton would win the popular vote by 3 percentage points. She ended up winning it by 2 and lost the Electoral College. Joe Biden won it by 5 and barely won the Electoral College. But this is a redeeming quality for President Biden, that voters can disapprove of him and still very easily vote for him. Because even if his approval rating just narrowly bumps up by 3, 4, 5 points, that could be the difference between victory and defeat for Biden. He could be in a reality where he is down 10 points nationwide in approval and still wins re-election. Because as we've seen thus far, Donald Trump intends to run for re-election, but Donald Trump's numbers aren't exactly recovering. And voters aren't exactly inclined to vote for President Trump despite disapproving of President Biden. The same thing can be seen on the national generic ballot and is impacting the Republican Party's chances at victories in governor elections, House elections, and in control of some very important chambers. Democrats might actually hold on to the U.S. Senate despite having their narrowest majority since the year 2000. And I say that not kidding. The narrowest majority in over 20 years. An easily winnable victory for the GOP. 2010, they won 6 seats. 2014, the Republican Party picked up 9 seats. Yet they're struggling to just get 1. Because voters, while clearly angry at the president, can't bring themselves to vote against his party. And that's the most fascinating thing we've seen thus far in these midterm elections. I still think, and I still stand by my expectation that 2022 will be a red wave year, but I definitely don't expect 2024 to be so. I think 2024 will be competitive, and that is only reaffirmed in my belief by new numbers that come out from the New York Times, Siena College, and other pollsters that have released similar data that shows Biden down tremendously, but still up on the overall 2024 ballot. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.